I would say, what would you consider to be the core ideas of the book and its central argument?
Well, this book, as I mentioned, focuses on learning in the context of inclusive quality education for all. That's quite a large goal, quality, inclusive education for all. But my book examines the role of education and how it's evolved and around the world in light of both political and commercial ambitions, technological advancements, and knowledge sharing. And it also looks at the present initiatives that are being made to try and improve education and at the obstacles that exist to realizing inclusive quality education. It describes the progress and the challenges of Sustainable Development Goal 4, and it maintains, and this is perhaps the most important thing, it maintains that sustainable development will be severely impaired. It won't be available. We won't be able to achieve sustainable development unless new approaches to education are prioritized everywhere. And it's obvious because we're not achieving the goals that the Agenda 2030 have set. And it's very much because of the way education has been taken. And it looks at these new approaches that have been going on, and they're all very valuable, but they also miss something. And I look at and try to analyze what it is that is missing and that isn't helping these approaches be cohesive and make people focus on achieving dignity and well-being and contentment. And part of that is because education has become so directed, so focused on economic development, on the fact that each individual skal manage to function in the modern economy rather than to be a full human being. And in connection with that, I feel that it's important to develop a pedagogy that cultivates holistic learning processes that emphasize the following things, and this is very much the point of this book. They emphasize wondering, curiosity, care, audacity, unity, and justice. And that education has to be a transformative force that not only doesn't only develop and nurture intellectual growth, but also the development of compassionate and engaged global citizens. And around here, that's not something that people talk about very much. We have a lot of research being done on transformative education, and we can talk more about that later. But the idea that learning is, at best, and this is what I like to say, it's a voyage from wonder to wisdom. It's a journey from innocence to insight. And I believe that learning blazes the trail to individual integrity and potentially to global unity. Education is the systemized process of learning. And it's generally regarded as a means of empowering the disenfranchised and catalyzing human development, right? And as we all know, it's identified as a fundamental human right. And, people often say that education is considered essential for the exercise of all the other human rights. But most people, I don't know whether you do or if our listeners do, but most people identify or think about education as what they themselves experienced in school. And that's very varied. And as I try to explain in this book, existing systems of education, their structures, their content, their methodologies. They are completely diverse for people around the globe, and for many people, they're completely non-existent. They don't have access to school education and to schooling. And, research confirms, and I think many readers will agree with, many of the listeners will agree to this, that research confirms that education at its worst is indoctrination, a vehicle for propaganda, and maintaining the status quo. And I won't go into present politics, but we can look back on history and we can see that this has been the case all over the world. But it's also a problem of outdated methods, poorly qualified teachers, irrelevant content, insufficient resources. So, it's understandable that education can't meet the challenges of this complex world, but it still doesn't mean that we can't try to improve it and find ways of making education to become a goal. Excuse me. And, as I mentioned, I present a kind of an outline for a new way of thinking, a more holistic way of thinking about learning. And as I say, I talk about wondering, wandering, caring, and daring as the processes. I also look at curiosity, creativity, language, and ethics as the catalysts. And then I'm very keen on the fact that the contents should be the wealth of all human knowledge. In our part of the world, the maths and the sciences have now overtaken the liberal arts, and our other things are all thrown out. There needs to be this breadth of knowledge. But perhaps the biggest thing, and I'm not the only one who's been trying to push this, and this is one of the core elements of the book, that is that the outcome of education and learning shouldn't just be knowing. It has to be sharing, and it has to be serving. And this aspect of serving is something that's beginning to take on, that people are beginning to become more and more aware and interested of. And this is, of course, a key element of Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you so much for that. I find that to be very interesting because, I do a lot of research in history. And, when we look into the history of colonial education, we get and to see and comprehensively understand how education can be manipulated to achieve certain political outcomes. In our part of the world, I'm from Zimbabwe, my co-host is from Malawi. We were under what was called a Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland. And the colonial education of that particular time was divided into African and European education, with clear intentions of, achieving very different kind of outcomes, where the Africans would provide the labor force and the Europeans would provide maybe the owners of factories and those who run the industries and, factories and banks and so forth. So that is, some of the historical examples we get to draw. I think I'm just going to give a few minutes to Mr. Gondola to just briefly share, because he did a research in his psychometrics research that he looked at some very important issues, and now is also doing some interesting inquiry. So Mr. Gondola, I think I'm just going to give you a few minutes. Nice.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kiwumbu. Professor Victoria, I was so interested when you are talking about education needs to be like, we need to have that value of equity, caring, and having like equal opportunity of education, because as Dr. Chikumba has already talked, back home in Malawi and Zim, to have access to education is very hard. It's so hard. So right now, mainly my research interest is funny. It's more relating to your book somehow, somewhere, because I'm so interested in educational equity, fairness, and accuracy. So I try to connect the diverse group of people and use some measurement in psychometrics and statistics to come up with that validity study of interpretability and accuracy and equity in all the groups of people which have been underrepresented. So when I was listening to you, I was so interested that you're talking these things in all the sides that your book has covered. I was like, okay, this is so interesting to me. Yeah, so based on the history of Malawi in general, as Malawi separately, I think the education system which we had is based on the colonial readers. Until now, we are still using the same thing, but it hasn't changed because to have those changes, it needs a lot of time. It needs a lot of like preparations to do that. So what I'm trying to focus on, the article which I'm trying to write now is a small change can help part of the system of the education, just starting from somewhere which we think can be this like the best opportunity to start. Let's say accessibility. It can be one of the places which we can start changing. Because if we start with the part of the system of the education which we think like it might help in the other steps which are coming after that, it's a better way of improving than the whole system at once. At least starting with a step by step to reach that goal, because as a thing which is so like it will take a long time to change. It needs time and it needs uh, to be divided into stages for that process to be done. So I'm focusing on the accessibility in Malawi so that we can achieve that goal that every student, regardless of, let's say, gender, location, uh, we can say that region, they should be able to access that type of education, which every parent, every nation wants the citizens of that country to have, like Malawi.
Mhm.
Thank you very much.
Oh, nice, nice.